Nick, the probably biggest thing I learned from reading these cases and analyzing these factors the department has set forth in these cases is that the thing they're most concerned about is self-disclosure. This is seen by every person I've talked to, lawyer, accountant, CFO, corporate in-house, compliance, GC, as the most difficult decision a company has. Because you're opening the kimono to everything. And that just scares the bejesus out of a lot of people. But what the DOJ has made clear is they will credit companies who self-disclose from a financial penalty perspective in a huge way. I really wanted to go through these cases because I thought they gave us just some incredible lessons around what the DOJ will give for self-disclosure. And I can't think of a better way to do that than ABB. This is the case where there was an attempt to self-disclose, and it was only an attempt because literally the company scheduled a meeting with the Department of Justice. They didn't tell them what the meeting was for. It was to self-disclose. And the day before the meeting, the story broke in South Africa about ABB's bribery and corruption scheme. They did not technically self-disclose. They didn't self-disclose. It was in the public record. But they had tried to. And what interested me the most, in addition to that timing, was how much the DOJ spent talking about it. And because they spent so much time talking about it, it struck me that it's incredibly important. So maybe what did you see in the ABB case?
I think the DOJ is trying really hard to give clarity to the market. Yeah, I think you can read the tea leaves, you can read between the lines, and this is what we're talking about right now. You can read between the lines and see what's important to them. And I think the thing that I've seen time and time again in this space is there's like this kind of frustration. Just let's talk about like effectiveness, for example. This concept of effectiveness, there's a lack of sort of clarity or guidance around what that means that causes a lot of consternation for people, a lot of anxiety. And I think the DOJ is trying to be as clear as they can, and they're trying to show with their actions what the spirit of the law is. And I was talking to Andrew McBride recently, and he was telling me a little bit about his interaction with the DOJ. And as he talked about it, it was what I expected, that they want to work in good faith with companies. They want to be aligned in terms of, we should all be aligned in terms of trying to drive risk out of our organizations or drive corruption out of our organizations. And I think to the extent they see even an inkling of a genuine eagerness or like an authentic desire to root out the things that are wrong, I think they're trying to show with their actions that like they're going to reward that. So again, the ABB one, perhaps it is like a little bit interesting that they would be so like they would reward something that seems so menial or so inconsequential. But again, I think it's that. I think it's they want to show in instances where they can how they're going to behave in order to prompt more of that behavior from the market.
Let me pick up on something you said there, and I'm going to use that as an introduction. These were the words of Kenneth Polite, who was then, at the time, the Assistant Attorney General, and he said before the meeting, and that was the meeting where ABB was going to self-disclose, a media report drew attention to the wrongdoing. But because the company could demonstrate, number one, intent, and number two, efforts to self-disclose, without the knowledge of the media report, the DOJ weighed both the early detection of the misconduct and the intent in ABB's favor. And what you said, Nick, was, or I thought I heard you say, is it's never one thing. It's not just self-disclosure. It's also your intent. It's also your efforts. It's also the effectiveness of your compliance program. And so what I want people to understand is it starts with self-disclosure. That's not the end, because we're going to talk about a lot of other factors. But if you can set a tone with the department, then not only will what you do be viewed favorably, but if you continue to do that in terms of the information you give them, in terms of the effectiveness of the compliance program you create, and the data that you present to them to demonstrate that, it can really lead to a very significant reduction in your overall fine and penalty. And I think ABB really bore that out, because as the first three-time recidivists, they still had a relatively low overall fine and penalty. as well for conduct that literally went from South Africa all the way up to the corporate office. But they didn't simply try to self-disclose. And we'll go into this and some of the other factors, they extensively remediated, they extraordinarily cooperated, and they put together a program that was tested by the time the resolution went around. So it's just, it's a several factors, but it all starts with trying to self-disclose.
I think it comes down to that genuine effort. And it's easy to think about this adversary in the DOJ as this sort of unreasonable entity. And I don't think that's true. I think that they have a lot of visibility into different programs. They understand the complexity of businesses, that things don't go right. It's unreasonable to expect there to be no risk in a business, of course. So I think they try to show and act in a reasonable way. And I think they're ultimately trying to get down to clarity and get down to truth. If you're going through a financial audit, no audit is perfect. The way you interact with those auditors, it's not just the numbers on the page and the testing they do that drives their conclusion. It's also the way you interact with them. And it's also the subjective sense that they get from your drive to stamp out, apply the right controls or stamp out unnecessary risks. And I just think when they can see a genuine effort to not just check a box and play a game or respond to something that showed up in the papers, but rather, hey, we think there's a problem. Here are the steps we're taking to try to rectify it. If there's a genuineness to that, I think those all go on the right side of the ledger. You know what I'm saying? Those are all points for your organization because that's what they're trying to get down to. They know that there's always going to be risks.
Nick, let's turn to Albemarle because here we had another interesting wrinkle. We did have self-disclosure, but we had self-disclosure 16 months after the company either determined internally, a whistleblower reported internally, or some control picked it up. And what the DOJ said about this was that and let me just read from this, the self-disclosure was not within a reasonably prompt time after becoming aware of the misconduct. So there's a wrinkle that we need compliance professionals to understand. I don't think Albemarle sat on it, but they didn't self-disclose. And what I really want people to understand is, yes, it's self-disclosure, but when you find out, you have to move quickly. You have to move quickly to assess through triage. You have to move quickly to investigate. You have to move quickly to get the information to the decision makers. Here, the decision makers ultimately decided to self-disclose, and Albemarle got credit for that. And we'll talk about some of the other things they did as well later on in this podcast series. But you can't wait that long anymore. You have to get that. But what that means is you have to have the structure in place to intake that information, triage it, get it investigated. So how do you help companies put that structure in place? I understand you guys have a hotline, but that's just a starting point. How do you move to these other steps?
It's a great question. I think you have to start with a vision in your mind of what good looks like and start trying to move toward that. The hotline itself, to your point, is just a starting point. I think, and perhaps I'm biased, but if I was coming to stand up a program, the first thing I would do is put in enterprise-wide disclosure tool and start trying to get more participation in that process through education and through awareness and things like that, because there's just so much risk intelligence in the organization. And that to me is always the best place to start. Those boots on the ground, giving them a voice and having a smart way to sort through those items and focus on the ones that move the needle the most. But it's a big challenge, right, to do those other things, especially if you're starting from scratch, or especially if the garden's been overgrown with corruption weeds or whatever it is. There's definitely not a silver bullet answer for that. But again, I think compliance is culture at the end of the day, and we can affect culture, whether it's broadly at the top or whether it's how we interact with the workforce. And those opinions in the hearts and minds of the employee base whose participation we need to do our job, those opinions can be affected by tangible representations of what we're trying to achieve. We want to drive out corruption from our organization. We want to have a more integrity forward company. What is the vision we have and what are we trying to solve? And I think it's easy to get people to start humming along with a song if they've heard it a couple of times. But I think we often don't sing that song enough. People don't hear the song enough to be able to catch the tune.
Nick, I'd like to end with SAP. SAP is very interesting, obviously, at least in my mind, one of the most ubiquitous companies literally across the world. If they are not the biggest, software or ERP software maker and installer, I don't know who is, maybe Oracle, but every company I've worked in had or talked about SAP. I think they're in 104 countries even, but they were a recidivist, meaning they'd had a prior FCPA enforcement action in the middle of the last decade, and they did not self-disclose. And what I found most interesting about the lack of self-disclosure in the enforcement action, Nick, was the ink the DOJ put in there talking about they didn't self-disclose. And you can emphasize something by writing about it positively. You can emphasize something by writing about it negatively. And to me, this was a great example of the DOJ saying SAP could have gotten between 50 to 75% discount if they had self-disclosed based on their other actions after the DOJ came knocking. And so that, to me, was a very clear message. And if I could even drive it home a little bit further, I estimated that the failure to self-disclose itself cost $20 million under the sentencing guidelines. That's separate and apart from the corporate enforcement policy. And potentially SAP could have saved another $94 million. So when you think about the way the fines and penalties work, there's a range of, there's an assessed penalty, there's a multiplier put on that, and then there's a range given, a low range and a high range. Under the corporate enforcement policy, a company that self-discloses and meets the other criteria can be eligible for up to 75% off the low end.
Huge.
And SAP potentially could have had a discount of 94 million plus the 20 million they lost under the sentencing guidelines. That's real money. And I understand, and I've already said 3 times in this podcast, yes, this is a difficult decision. And whatever it may cost you psychologically, I think the DOJ's really tried to make it financially attractive to consider and to self-disclose. What are your thoughts from just the financials? How do you advise somebody with the numbers?
I think you're dead right. Like, they are trying to be very clear, and they're eating their own dinner. They're talking about incentives in their guidance, and they're using tangible, real dollar incentives to try to drive these kinds of behaviors. So you can at least see that consistency there. I would probably argue that the cost of this lack of self-disclosure, there's probably several different layers of the negative externalities that come from that. It probably is way beyond the 120 or the 115 million you just came up with. Let's just say it's just that. That is a massive number. And if the question is, how do we alert organizations and get them more comfortable with the value that they are going to burn away by not self-disclosing, then that's somewhat formulaic, right? That's somewhat formulaic because we know what those multipliers are and what those ranges are. I think more broadly, though, man, it's hard to wrap your head around $115 million like lost savings that were available. I just think at the end of the day, I just always think it's so incumbent on us from a high agency perspective I just have to believe that there's a way to pick that lock and convince and persuade somebody at the top who is maybe hemming and hawing about it. Like, they might not know the ramifications of it. They might not know the details of these reductions that are available and what timeliness means from a self-disclosure perspective. And I think it's on us to make sure that those elements in the equation are part of the calculus in that decision. And to what you're saying before, I understand the desire to not go to your boss, the DOJ, with a problem without a solution, right? Like, we all have, I don't want to go to my board and say, hey guys, something went really wrong. And just my natural desire is to say, this went wrong and this is what I'm doing about it. Because I don't want them to think I'm incompetent or to get any of the negative things that can come from that kind of a perception. And I think what the DOJ is saying is that's not what they're looking for. They're not looking for you to wait 9 months after you've known something until you have a fully baked plan to come to them with. They want voluntary disclosure. They want full participation. And they want appropriate remediation. That's what they want. They want speed over a fully baked plan because those plans never work anyways, I don't think. I just think there's so much opportunity in being like authentic about this stuff. We talk about this with the speak up culture. You can put a poster on the wall, but if people don't feel that authenticity, then you don't get any of the values, or you don't get any of the value that can come from that kind of a thing. And again, if there's not this authenticity with how we did this transparency with how we deal with the DOJ, then I think you eliminate access to the benefits that come from these incentives that they're putting in place.
Nick, you used a phrase I want to end with, which was, it wasn't lost opportunity cost. It was lost opportunity for savings.
Right.
Is that, I've talked to you a lot over the years, and you've told me about different formulas you'd use to try to assess the potential ROI of a company or potential other returns on investments. Is there a way, if you're the number cruncher in a company and I come to you and say, we need to figure out how to present the savings opportunity, is that a real number within a corporation? Do people like you do that?
So I'm not trying to be obtuse with the answer, but like any of these numbers work because it's just a persuasion mechanism. Going to leadership and saying, listen, this thing has come up. I just want to make sure we all understand how this thing can swing, and doing a 3-year projection on total cost of these two different paths, because some of those costs are going to multiply. Like the remediation, the oversight of all that stuff can be significantly different if the DOJ thinks that they are dealing with a bad actor versus them dealing with somebody who is, hey, we're on the same side, we're all fighting the same battle. That whole process can be so much more difficult. So I'm just saying, with some basic assumptions, you can, on the back of a napkin, say, this is a $200 million decision, or this is a $500 million decision. It's just a way to get a conversation going, because I just don't think everybody knows about this. Everybody at the board level or at the CEO level, they don't know the intricacies of how the DOJ is using language describing SAP or ABB to drive what is the implication, or like what the true like impact of something going wrong is going to be. That's on us to describe that and demonstrate that. And listening to stuff that you do, or reading this book and seeing some of these numbers, these can give us a basis to start to paint a picture. Like, that picture is never going to be totally accurate, but it's a painting, and it gives somebody a sense of what they're going to be dealing with and what they're going to be looking at potentially. And look, if SAP made this decision knowing full well that, hey, this is a $100 million bet and we don't care, then fine. But I don't know that with certainty. And I would bet that was not like how this resulted. I bet somebody who made that decision, who reads this book or saw the lack of reduction that they didn't get, they got to be like, man, I would have played that different.
Is that a conversation you can have with a CFO, real cost savings? Is that something that a CFO would listen to, if not even respond to?
CFOs live in the future. I guess they live in the past, but like a true CFO is also going to be living in the future, and they're going to be responsible for the budget of the organization, and they're going to be responsible. Their department's going to be responsible for the projections. What does next year's budget look like? What does the 3-year projections that we have to give the bank look like? And so they inherently know that in that process, there are just layers and layers of assumptions. You're trying to look into a crystal ball and see what the future is. That doesn't exist. So you have to just make all of these assumptions. And I think having that kind of a conversation where we're talking about what are the underlying assumptions driving what we think the future is going to look like, moving the conversation from something ethereal and something in the conditional tense of should to like, hey, our view of the future and how these numbers are going to actually play out, they can be significantly different because of this. And here's my view of, if we disclose now, best case scenario, or if we don't disclose, worst case scenario, how these costs are going to swing over the next couple of years. And I guarantee the CFO is not thinking about that. They're not thinking about how much a monitor costs. They're not thinking about the lost like efficiency that comes from all of that stuff. You've talked to hundreds of people that have been through these processes. It's a ton of work. It's a ton of money. It's a ton of expense that's just not on anyone's radar. So bringing that up and shining a light on it, I think there's always value in it from an interdepartmental perspective. But that, I think, is the type of conversation that a CFO is like apt to have. That's the kind of conversations they're having all the time.
Nick, I hope if our listeners take away one thing from this episode, it is that the DOJ's made clear that their number one priority is self-disclosure. Whatever the reasons might be, it really doesn't matter, but they've communicated that. So if find yourself in this situation, I hope you will seriously consider self-disclosure.